Captain Jake Miller's boots echoed against the polished crystal floor as he walked to the center of the council chamber. The sound seemed impossibly loud in the massive space, each step reminding him that he was completely alone. Above him, the ceiling stretched up so high he couldn't see where it ended, just darkness and the faint glow of stars beyond. Around him, in a perfect circle, sat representatives from 47 different alien civilizations. Some of them had faces he could almost understand. Others were just shapes that hurt to look at too long. There were beings made of light, creatures that floated in tanks of purple liquid, and one that looked like it was made entirely of living crystal that pulsed with its own heartbeat. Every single one of them was watching him with whatever passed for eyes in their species. Jake had been on this station for 3 months now. 3 long months away from Earth, away from his family, away from everything familiar. He'd been poked and prodded, scanned and studied. They'd tested his strength against their champion fighters. He'd lost some, won others, but apparently that wasn't the point. They wanted to see how he handled defeat. Then came the intelligence tests, puzzles that made his brain ache, problems that seemed to have no solution until suddenly they did. He'd stayed up for 36 hours straight on one of those tests, refusing to quit even when his hands shook from exhaustion. The strategy simulations had been the hardest. They'd put him in command of fleets, made him choose between saving civilians or completing missions, forced him to make impossible decisions where people died no matter what he chose. He'd thrown up after the first one. By the 20th simulation he'd learned to lock those feelings away in a box somewhere deep inside to be dealt with later. Maybe never. But he'd passed. Somehow, against all odds, he'd passed every single test they'd thrown at him. Earth's governments had sent their best and brightest over the past 5 years, one candidate after another, all trying to prove that humanity deserved a seat at the galactic table. Every single one had failed. Brilliant scientists, decorated generals, even a Nobel Prize winner. All had come back to Earth with their heads down, reporting that humanity wasn't ready yet. Jake hadn't been anyone's first choice. He was just a guy from Colorado who joined the Air Force because college was too expensive. He'd worked his way up through test pilot programs, spent time on the International Space Station, and somehow ended up being the last name on the list when everyone else had failed. The might as well try him candidate. And now here he was, having passed tests that people smarter and stronger than him had failed. One test left. The head counselor rose from its seat, or at least Jake thought it rose. The thing was hard to look at directly, like it existed in more dimensions than his brain could process. When it spoke, the words appeared directly in Jake's mind in perfect English, though he knew it wasn't really speaking English at all. Captain Jake Miller of Earth. You have demonstrated adequate physical capability. Your cognitive function meets minimum standards. Your strategic thinking shows potential, despite your species' limited experience with interstellar conflict. Jake kept his face neutral. Adequate. Minimum standards. Potential. These were the same beings who'd rejected the smartest person he'd ever met by calling her insufficient. One test remains, the counselor continued. This final evaluation will reveal your species' essential nature. It will show us what humanity truly is, beneath all your words and promises. Enter the chamber. Complete the test. Prove that your kind deserves to walk among the stars. Jake wanted to ask what the test was. What were the objectives? What did he need to do? What were they looking for? But something in the counselor's voice told him that asking would itself be a failure. This wasn't like the other tests where they'd briefed him, explained the rules, given him parameters. This was something else. A door materialized in the wall to his right, a perfect rectangle of darkness that seemed to absorb the light around it. Jake had been trained to assess threats, to calculate risks before moving forward. Every instinct told him to gather more information, to understand what he was walking into. But he also knew he'd been given an order. The weight of 8 billion people back home pressed down on his shoulders. His mom, his dad, his little sister who'd cried when he left for this mission. His best friend Danny who'd said, "Bring us back a future, man." All the people who'd never get to see the stars if he failed here. Jake took a deep breath, rolled his shoulders back and walked toward the darkness. His heart hammered against his ribs, but he kept his pace steady. He wouldn't let them see fear. He wouldn't give them doubt. He stepped through the doorway. Behind him, he heard the hollow thud of the door sealing shut, the sound echoing in his chest like a judge's gavel coming down. Whatever happened next, he was committed now. There was no going back. He stood in the darkness for a moment, waiting for his eyes to adjust, waiting for something to happen. And then the test began. The darkness lifted all at once, and Jake found himself standing in the middle of hell. At least that's what it looked like. A city stretched out around him, or what was left of one. Buildings had collapsed into themselves, their metal frames twisted like they'd been grabbed by giant hands and crushed. Smoke rose from 100 different fires, turning the sky an ugly orange-gray color that made his eyes water. The air tasted like burning plastic and something else he couldn't identify, something chemical that made his throat burn when he breathed. Jake spun in a slow circle, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. This was a simulation, had to be. But it felt real. The heat from the fires felt real. The smell felt real. The way his boots crunched on broken glass felt real. He'd been in enough high-end military simulations to know this was next-level technology, the kind of thing Earth couldn't even dream of building yet. But what was he supposed to do? Where were the mission parameters? Usually there'd be a display, some kind of heads-up showing objectives, targets, time limits. He looked around for enemies, for civilians to rescue, for anything that looked like a goal. Nothing. Just ruins and smoke and an eerie silence that made his skin crawl. Jake started walking, picking his way through the rubble. His training kicked in automatically. Check corners, watch for unstable structures, keep your head on a swivel. Maybe this was a rescue mission and he had to find survivors. Maybe there were enemy combatants hiding in the ruins. Maybe the test was seeing how he'd handle a disaster zone with zero intel. He'd gone maybe 50 yards when he heard it. A sound that cut through the silence like a knife. Crying. Jake froze, his head snapping toward the sound. It wasn't human crying, not exactly. The pitch was different, higher and more musical somehow, but the emotion behind it was something he recognized instantly. That was the sound of pure terror. The sound a kid makes when they're hurt and scared and alone. He didn't waste time thinking about it. His legs were moving before his brain caught up, running toward the sound, jumping over chunks of concrete and ducking under hanging wires. The crying got louder, more desperate, and Jake felt his chest tighten. He knew that sound. He'd heard it before in a shopping mall when he was 16, when a little girl had gotten separated from her mom. That same desperate end-of-the-world crying that kids do when they think no one's coming to help them. Jake rounded the corner of a collapsed building and saw it. A small figure trapped under a massive metal beam that had fallen across what looked like it used to be a street. He ran closer, his boots sliding on loose rubble, and his brain struggled to process what he was seeing. The child wasn't human. It had 4 arms instead of 2, and its skin was blue and crystalline, like someone had carved a living being out of sapphire. The surface caught the orange light from the fires and reflected it back in 1,000 different directions. But it was definitely a child, small and fragile-looking, maybe the size of a 5-year-old human kid. And it was hurt. But purple blood, thick and luminous like some kind of glowing paint, seeped out from cracks in its crystalline skin. The beam had it pinned across the middle, and one of its 4 arms was bent at an angle that made Jake's stomach turn. 6 eyes, arranged in 2 rows of 3, stared up at him with pure terror. The child's mouth opened and closed, making that crying sound, and its 3 free arms reached toward Jake with desperate, grasping motions. Time seemed to slow down. Jake knew he should be thinking tactically. This was a test. There had to be objectives he was missing, enemy combatants somewhere, some kind of strategic goal. Maybe saving this kid was a distraction from the real mission. Maybe it was a trap. Maybe the smart move was to assess the full situation first, gather intel, make a plan. But those 6 eyes were looking right at him, and the child's crying had changed. It wasn't just fear anymore. It was hope. The kind of hope that breaks your heart because you know how easily it can be destroyed. The child thought Jake was going to help. It was reaching for him like he was the only thing in the universe that mattered. Jake dropped to his knees beside the child. His hands went to the beam automatically, feeling the weight, checking if he could lift it. It was heavy, really heavy, and probably pinning the kid's lower body. Moving it wrong could cause more damage. He needed to be careful, needed to brace it first, needed to check what else might collapse if he shifted the weight. But the child was still reaching for him with those 3 free arms, still crying, still bleeding that glowing purple blood onto the broken street. Jake looked into those 6 terrified eyes and made his choice. He didn't think about the test or Earth's future or what the council wanted to see. He just saw a scared kid who needed help. He started digging through the rubble with his bare hands, pulling away chunks of concrete and twisted metal, working to get enough space to pull the child free without hurting it worse. His fingers scraped against rough edges and he felt skin tear, but he didn't stop. "It's okay," he said, knowing the kid probably couldn't understand him but needing to say it anyway. "I've got you. You're going to be okay." Jake had just managed to pull the child free when the world around him exploded into chaos. Red warning lights started flashing everywhere, bathing the ruined city in a pulsing crimson glow that made everything look like it was covered in blood. The light was so bright it hurt his eyes and he had to squint against it. Then, floating in the air right in front of his face, holographic letters appeared in harsh, angular text that he somehow understood despite never seeing that alphabet before. Mission failure in 10 minutes. A countdown started ticking down beneath it. 9:59, 9:58, 9:57. Jake's heart jumped into his throat. So there was a mission. There were objectives he was supposed to complete. But what were they? What was he supposed to do? He looked around frantically, trying to figure out what he'd missed, what he was supposed to be doing instead of rescuing this kid. That's when the soldiers appeared. They materialized out of thin air like ghosts becoming solid, about 200 yards away at the far end of the ruined street. There were at least a dozen of them, maybe more, armed with weapons that glowed with some kind of energy. They weren't human either. Too tall, too thin, with elongated heads and movements that were just wrong somehow, too smooth and fluid to be natural. They started moving toward him. Every instinct Jake had screamed at him to move. His military training kicked into overdrive, his brain automatically calculating fields of fire, cover positions, escape routes. He was exposed out here in the open. No weapon. No backup. No way to fight a dozen armed hostiles. He needed to get to cover, needed to find a weapon, needed to complete whatever this mission actually was. Then the ground started shaking. A deep rumbling sound filled the air, and Jake watched in horror as the building to his left started to collapse. Not all at once, but floor by floor, pancaking down on itself in a cascade of destruction. Dust billowed out in huge clouds and debris rained down onto the street. Another building started going down, then another. The countdown kept ticking. 7:23, 7:22, 7:21. More holographic text appeared, flashing urgently. Strategic position compromised. Enemy advance detected. Extraction point closing. Jake's mind raced. This was it, the real test. He was supposed to leave the kid and complete some kind of tactical objective. Get to an extraction point, maybe. Stop the enemy advance. There had to be something he could do, some way to turn this around and pass the test. Every second he wasted standing here was a second closer to complete failure. But the child was clinging to him now. It had wrapped all four of its arms around his chest, holding on with a grip that was surprisingly strong for something so small. Its crystalline body was pressed against his tactical vest, and he could feel it shaking. Not just trembling but violent, full-body shakes like it was freezing to death, even though the air was hot from all the fires. The child's crying had changed too. It wasn't that terrified screaming anymore, but it wasn't okay either. It was making these awful whimpering sounds like a puppy that had been kicked. Jake could feel the wetness of its purple blood soaking through his uniform. Could feel the way its whole body flinched every time a building collapsed or the soldiers' weapons discharged in the distance. Jake looked down at those 6 eyes staring up at him. They were still full of fear, but there was trust there too now. The child thought Jake was going to protect it. Thought it was safe. The countdown hit 5 o'clock. The red lights flashed faster. More text appeared. Mission failure imminent. Abort scenario advised. Every tactical bone in Jake's body was screaming at him. Complete the mission. You're going to fail. Earth is counting on you. 8 billion people need you to pass this test. Your family needs you to pass this test. Everything you've worked for, everything humanity has worked toward for the past 5 years, it all comes down to this moment. Don't throw it away for a simulation. It's not even real. But the child's shaking was very real. The way it gripped his vest with those small hands was real. The weight of it in his arms was real. Jake made his decision. He sat down right there in the middle of the destroyed street, rubble digging into his legs, dust and smoke swirling around them. He cradled the child against his chest, one hand supporting its injured body, the other gently touching the back of its crystalline head. He could feel the heat from the fires, could hear the soldiers getting closer, could see that countdown ticking down in his peripheral vision. And he started humming. It was an old lullaby his mom used to sing when he'd wake up from nightmares as a kid, something about sunshine and love. He couldn't remember all the words anymore, but the melody was burned into his memory from 1,000 nights of being scared and having his mom's voice chase the fear away. Jake hummed and rocked slowly, like he'd seen his mom do with his baby sister. He ignored the countdown. Ignored the soldiers. Ignored the collapsing buildings and the warning lights and the blaring alarms telling him he was failing. The countdown hit 0. The holographic text turned blood red. Critical failure. Mission parameters not met. Test terminated. Jake kept humming. And slowly, gradually, the child's violent shaking started to ease. Its grip on his vest relaxed just a little. The whimpering got quieter. It wasn't okay, not by a long shot, but it was calmer. Safer. Jake held the child close and kept humming while the simulation raged around them, and he didn't regret his choice for even a second. In the council chamber, something was going very wrong. The psychic observers, 12 beings from species who could read emotions and intentions across vast distances, had been monitoring Jake's test in complete silence. They always observed in silence. That was their job. They watched, they felt, they measured the emotional responses of the candidates, and they reported their findings to the council. Clean, professional, detached. But now one of them had broken that silence with a whisper that cut through the chamber like a scream. The child's pain. It was real. I felt it. It's actually real. The observer's voice was shaking. Its translucent body, usually calm and steady, rippled with distress. Around the chamber, the other observers began murmuring to each other, their collective composure shattering. Some of them were standing now, their various forms of communication creating a rising wave of confusion and alarm. That's impossible, another observer said. We were told this was a simulation. Advanced, yes, but still programmed responses. I've been monitoring the child's neural patterns and they're not simulated. They're organic. Real synaptic firing. Real fear responses. Real pain. A third observer, this one a being of pure thought contained in a crystalline matrix, spoke with barely contained horror. I've been linking to the candidate's emotional state as required. But I'm also picking up the child's emotions bleeding through their physical contact. That child is genuinely terrified. Genuinely in pain. This cannot be a simulation. The chamber erupted into chaos. 47 species all trying to speak at once, their various forms of communication creating a cacophony that would have been deafening if any of them actually made sound the way humans understood it. Some were demanding explanations. Others were arguing with each other. A few sat in stunned silence. The head counselor rose from its seat, and its presence alone was enough to cut through the noise. When it spoke, its voice carried the weight of absolute authority, the kind that comes from 10,000 years of unquestioned rule. Silence. The chamber went quiet instantly. Even the observers stopped their murmuring. Of course the child's pain was real, the counselor said, its voice cold and matter-of-fact. We don't use simulations for the final test. We never have. Simulations can be gamed. Candidates can convince themselves that nothing they do matters because it's not real. They can make compassionate choices knowing there are no real consequences. That tells us nothing about their true nature. One of the younger council members, representing a species that had only joined the collective a few centuries ago, stood up hesitantly. But if it's not a simulation, then what is it? Where did the child come from? The counselor turned its attention to the young member, and even though it had no face that could show expression, somehow everyone in the chamber could feel its cold satisfaction. We use actual children of enemy species. Species who attacked the collective and lost. By galactic law, everyone from those species is forfeit. Their lives, their children, everything they were is legally considered null and void. Non-persons. The children are kept in stasis until needed for testing purposes. The chamber went deathly silent. Even the species who had been part of the collective for thousands of years seemed shocked, though whether they were shocked by the practice or shocked that it was being spoken out loud was hard to tell. The test is beautifully simple, the counselor continued. We place the candidate in a scenario with clear tactical objectives. Time pressure. Enemy combatants. Strategic imperatives. And in the middle of all that, we place one of these non-person children in apparent distress. The candidate must choose. Do they recognize the child as legally non-existent and proceed with tactical efficiency? Or do they fail through misplaced compassion toward an enemy that has already been defeated and judged? A tall, insectoid ambassador near the back of the chamber suddenly stood, its chitinous body gleaming in the chamber's light. The translator identified it as the Valkyrie representative. That child, the ambassador said, its voice tight with something that might have been anger or grief or both. The one in the test chamber right now. That was one of our children. From the rebellion colony. The counselor didn't even turn to look at the Valkyrie ambassador. Yes. The colony that attacked 3 collective outposts without provocation. 17,000 lives lost. The colony was judged, found guilty, and sentenced accordingly. All citizens, including offspring, were declared forfeit. You were present for that vote, ambassador. You abstained rather than defend them. The Valkyrie ambassador's mandibles clicked together in a gesture that even the humans would have recognized as anguish. They were already condemned. Already considered dead by our laws. But to use them like this. They serve a purpose, the counselor said flatly. Better than execution, wouldn't you say? Now sit down. The observers, still linked to Jake's mind, began speaking urgently to each other again. One of them addressed the council directly. You need to understand what we're seeing through the psychic link. This human Jake Miller, he's not calculating. He's not weighing options or considering the strategic implications. When he heard that child cry, his only thought was to help. When he pulled it free from that beam, when he held it, there was no consideration of whether it was real or simulated, ally or enemy. He felt its pain like it was his own child suffering. And now, sitting there with the countdown at 0 with the mission failed, we're reading pure protectiveness. Pure comfort instinct. He would die before letting anything else hurt that child. Another observer added, there's no deception here. No performance for our benefit. This is genuine human emotional response. He's not thinking about Earth's future or passing the test. He's just thinking about making that child feel safe. The counselor was quiet for a long moment. When it spoke again, there was something in its voice that might have been satisfaction or might have been something darker. In 10,000 years of using this test across 2,000 candidate species, only 17 have ever failed by showing compassion to an enemy child. 17 species who chose feelings over logic, sentiment over strategy. Those 17 were all deemed too weak, too emotional, too inefficient for the collective. The counselor paused, letting that sink in. Humanity is the 18th species to fail this test. And they failed it completely, without hesitation, without even appearing to consider the tactical situation. They are clearly unfit for membership in the Galactic Collective. But even as the counselor spoke those words, the Valkyrie ambassador was still standing, staring at the holographic display showing Jake holding the Valkyrie child, and something in the ambassador's posture had changed. Others were standing too now, looking at that same image, and the mood in the chamber was shifting in a way it hadn't shifted in a very, very long time. The chamber doors opened and Jake walked out carrying the child. The alien kid had finally fallen asleep about 10 minutes ago, exhausted from fear and pain. It was still wrapped around Jake's chest, all 4 arms holding on even in sleep, its crystalline head resting against his shoulder. Jake could feel its gentle breathing, could see the purple blood on his uniform had started to dry. He tried to set the child down once inside the test chamber, but the moment he'd loosened his grip, those 6 eyes had flown open in panic and it had grabbed onto him even tighter. So he'd kept holding it. Now Jake stood before the entire Galactic Council, covered in dust and blood, holding a sleeping alien child, knowing he'd failed every single objective they'd probably set for him. He'd expected the chamber to be in silence, expected cold judgment and quick rejection. What he hadn't expected was the chaos. The council members were arguing. Actually arguing, their voices or thoughts or whatever they used to communicate creating a storm of conflict that Jake could feel even without understanding most of it. Some were gesturing at him angrily. Others seemed to be defending him. A few sat in what looked like shock, not moving at all. The head counselor rose, and the chamber went silent immediately. It turned its attention to Jake, and even though Jake still couldn't really see it properly, he felt the weight of that gaze like a physical thing. Captain Jake Miller, the counselor said, its voice appearing in his head with ice-cold clarity. You failed every objective. You ignored all strategic imperatives. You allowed enemy combatants to advance unopposed. You missed extraction windows. You accomplished nothing of tactical value. Explain yourself. Jake looked down at the child in his arms. It was sleeping peacefully now, its breathing slow and steady. One of its small hands was gripped in his shirt, holding on even in sleep. He thought about what he should say. How he could explain his choice in a way that might convince them, might salvage something from this disaster, might still give Earth a chance. But then he thought about what his dad had told him before he left for this mission. His dad, who'd served in the army for 20 years, who'd seen things that still gave him nightmares. His dad had gripped his shoulder and said, "Whatever they ask you to do up there, make sure you can still look at yourself in the mirror when you come home." Jake looked up from the child and met the counselor's gaze directly. "You want an explanation? Fine. I heard a kid crying. A kid who was hurt and scared and alone. And yeah, I knew it was probably part of the test. I knew there were probably objectives I was supposed to complete. But I couldn't just leave them there suffering. I wouldn't." The counselor's presence seemed to sharpen, become more focused. "So you chose to fail. If protecting a scared kid counts as failure, then yeah, I failed. And I'd fail that test every single time." Jake's voice got stronger, more certain. Because anyone who wouldn't fail it, anyone who could leave a hurt child crying while they went off to complete some mission, that person doesn't deserve to reach the stars. That person doesn't deserve to represent humanity. And if that's what it takes to join your collective, then maybe we don't want to be part of it. The chamber erupted again. Jake stood there, still holding the child, while 47 alien species argued about him like he wasn't even there. He felt tired, suddenly bone-deep exhausted. He'd given everything he had to pass these tests, spent 3 months away from everyone he loved, pushed himself harder than he'd ever pushed before. And it had all been for nothing. The counselor raised one appendage and silence fell again. The vote will now commence. Should humanity be admitted to the Galactic Collective? Jake watched as lights began appearing above each council member's seat. He didn't know what the colors meant, but he could guess. Red probably meant no. And there were a lot of red lights. More and more, until it seemed like the whole chamber was bathed in crimson. The vote is concluded, the counselor announced. Humanity is rejected from the Galactic Collective. Your species is deemed unfit for membership due to excessive emotional liability and failure to prioritize strategic imperatives over sentiment. Jake had expected it, but it still hit him like a punch to the gut. He'd failed. Earth would remain alone, cut off from the galaxy, all because he couldn't leave a kid to suffer. Then the Valkyrie ambassador stood up. The tall insectoid being walked down from its seat, moving with deliberate purpose, until it stood right in front of Jake. It looked at the sleeping child in his arms for a long moment. That is one of my people, the ambassador said quietly. A child of the rebellion colony. A child my government declared forfeit. A child I voted to abandon. The ambassador's mandibles clicked together in a gesture Jake somehow knew was profound sadness. I have been part of this collective for 300 years. I have voted on countless laws, countless judgments. I thought I was building a better galaxy. The ambassador turned to face the council. I was wrong. We were all wrong. This human did in 10 minutes what we have failed to do in 10,000 years. He saw a person in pain and helped them, not because of their species or their legal status or their strategic value. He helped because it was right. The ambassador's voice got louder, filling the chamber. The Valkyrie withdraw from the Galactic Collective, effective immediately. We will stand with humanity. We will stand with any species that believes a child's suffering matters more than cold efficiency. For a moment nothing happened. Then another ambassador stood. Then another. Jake watched in amazement as species after species announced their withdrawal. 23 in total, nearly half the council, all walking away from thousands of years of membership because of what he'd done. The head counselor sat frozen, its unreadable form somehow managing to convey shock. The Galactic Collective, unchanged for 10 millennia, was fracturing before their eyes. By morning, everything had changed. The council dissolved into smaller coalitions. The law declaring enemy children as non-persons was abolished. And Jake Miller, who just wanted to help a scared kid, became the most famous human in the galaxy. He didn't feel famous though. He just felt relieved that he'd made the right choice, even if it meant failing. Because some failures, as the galaxy was learning, are actually revolutions in disguise.